In its past life, it produced deadly weapons of war.
Now the state of Colorado is suing the U.S. government over who should control the contaminated areas that remain at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal.
10 miles outside Denver, the United States Army spent 40 years making nerve gas, mustard gas, and pesticides so lethal it killed birds on contact. Cleanup cost $2.1 billion and left 17,000 acres of soil too poisoned to plant a tree in. So in 1989, biologists released a few hundred prairie dogs into the dirt.
Hundreds of prairie dogs will soon be digging new homes at the Rocky Mountain National Wildlife Refuge, Rocky Flats, that is. Some of those animals moved in today.
Today, that ground holds a breeding population of the rarest mammal in North America, a herd of wild bison, a roost of bald eagles, and a professional soccer stadium where kids play on cleaned acres above buried nerve agent. 2-pound rodents did all of it. And the question is how? The poison factory that hid in plain sight.
A heads up from Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Today, the Fish and Wildlife Service will be doing a planned burn. It's going to start at 10 this morning and likely last until 4 o'clock this afternoon.
In 1942, the Army needed somewhere far enough inland that enemy bombers could not reach it. They picked Commerce City, Colorado, and they took it. 200 farming families lost their land overnight. Crops planted that spring went under the bulldozer. The schoolhouse became an officers' club. Within months, the site became one of the largest chemical weapons plants in the country. The factory produced mustard gas and the precursors for nerve agents. When the war ended, the factory did not close. The Army leased the same buildings to Shell Oil, which used them to make commercial pesticides. Aldrin, dieldrin, and other compounds the EPA later banned outright. For 30 years, two industries ran toxic operations on the same ground. Neither one cared where the waste went. It went straight into the dirt. Crews dumped millions of gallons of raw chemical runoff into unlined trenches and open ponds with no liners between the poison and the water table. Basin F, a 93-acre pit with nothing but a thin asphalt liner, held more than 200 million gallons of liquid waste. The Colorado sun evaporated the water and concentrated the sludge into something so toxic it killed birds that landed on the surface. Below ground, the poison seeped through the sandy soil into the aquifer. Plumes of contamination crept toward the municipal wells that supplied drinking water to 1.5 million people. Then it got worse. In the early 1960s, the Army drilled a hole 12,000 feet straight down into the bedrock and pumped 165 million gallons of toxic liquid into it under extreme pressure. The plan was to bury the problem so deep nothing could touch it. Instead, the pressurized fluid pried open ancient fault lines that had been quiet for over a century. Denver started having earthquakes, magnitude 5, in a city with no recorded seismic history. The pumping stopped. The quakes kept going for years as the pressure bled through the cracked rock. By 1987, the EPA classified the Rocky Mountain Arsenal as one of the worst toxic dumps in America. More than 600 chemical compounds were identified in the soil and water. The land could not support life. It could not hold water. The system was locked behind military fencing, poisoning everything around it. One detail saved the site. The buffer zones, thousands of acres of perimeter ground kept clear so civilians could not stumble into a gas leak, had been completely untouched for 40 years. No plowing, no development, no pesticide spraying. While Denver paved over every acre of farmland around it, the Army's security fence accidentally preserved small patches of native shortgrass prairie. Hidden inside them were colonies of black-tailed prairie dogs that had been quietly surviving the entire time. Nobody planned that. Nobody noticed it until the 1980s. And those colonies were about to become the most important detail on the entire site. The $2 billion containment. Every early attempt to clean the place was a disaster. The deep well injection triggered earthquakes. When the Army later tried to clean Basin F by excavating the sludge and drying it in the open air, the wind carried the fumes into Commerce City neighborhoods. Residents reported burning eyes, breathing problems, panic. The Army gave up and left the mess where it sat. The volume was the problem. You cannot incinerate 17,000 acres. You cannot truck millions of tons of contaminated dirt across the country to somewhere safer, because nowhere safer exists. So the strategy changed. Instead of removing the poison, they decided to entomb it where it sat. Over 15 years, the Army and Shell Oil spent $2.1 billion on the most expensive dirt-moving operation in American environmental history. Heavy equipment scraped the top 10 feet of soil off the contaminated zones. Trucks hauled millions of cubic yards of toxic earth into 2 enormous double-lined landfills built directly on site, where contamination ran deeper than 10 feet, and it often did. Crews capped it in place with engineered barriers built to shed every drop of rain away from the buried poison. 5 groundwater treatment plants filtered the aquifer continuously, pumping and re-injecting 1 billion gallons of water a year. But the caps had one weakness. Prairie dogs dig. They dig deep, they dig constantly, and they move enormous volumes of soil. If a colony established itself on top of a cap, the tunnels could punch right through the barrier and drag toxic material back to the surface. So, engineers built something into the caps. 18 inches of crushed concrete, sized and compacted so precisely that no burrowing mammal on the continent can get through it. The toxic pass sits sealed under a wall of rubble. By the time the containment was finished, the surface was technically safe. It was also dead, compacted, stripped. The machinery that contained the chemistry had destroyed the biology in the process. The native seed bank was gone, the fungal networks were gone, the soil structure was gone. What remained was flat, hard ground that could not hold water and could not support roots. The discovery that put a ferret on nerve gas soil. Here is where the story turns, because the most poisoned ground in the country is now home to the rarest mammal in North America, a predator that was declared extinct in the wild in 1979, and now breeds in burrows dug above sealed nerve agent. That outcome was not planned. It was not even imagined. It started with a roost of birds. In 1986, biologists working the buffer zones found a massive communal roost of bald eagles wintering on the arsenal. The eagles, protected under federal law, had been drawn in by the total absence of human disturbance, the mature cottonwoods, and the prey produced by those surviving prairie dog colonies. The discovery triggered a political fight. Audubon societies, the Sierra Club, and local activists pushed the same argument. This land becomes a refuge, not a subdivision. Congress agreed. That left the Fish and Wildlife Service with 15,000 acres of biologically dead ground that needed to become a functioning shortgrass prairie. There was no budget for tilling and seeding at that scale, and no equipment that could rebuild a soil structure from nothing. They needed a living engineer. They turned to the prairie dogs. In 1989, managers began expanding the remnant colonies in the buffer zones and added a targeted relocation of exactly 714 animals. 134 were trapped from undisturbed areas inside the arsenal. 534 came from urban construction sites across the Denver metro, rescued by a volunteer organization. 46 were brought in from a radio tracking study. Every animal was ear-tagged, dusted for fleas, and released into prepared burrows across the refuge. The job description was simple: stabilize the soil. Then the cascade started. The cascade nobody ordered. The first surprise came from underground. As the colonies grew, the tunneling did more than loosen the dirt. It restructured the soil. Each burrow system punched channels into the compacted earth, and rainwater that used to sheet off the surface like it was hitting pavement started soaking in. Roots followed the water down. The prairie dogs hauled mineral-rich material from depth up to the surface and mixed it with organic matter from their waste and decaying plants around their mounds. Bacteria, fungi, and invertebrates that the bulldozers had crushed out of existence started recolonizing the loosened ground. The soil began cycling nutrients again. A working ecosystem was reassembling itself one tunnel at a time. If a story about a chemical weapons factory being rebuilt by 2-pound rodents is why you clicked, subscribe before the next reveal. The cascade keeps climbing, and the animal waiting at the top of it should not exist. Once the soil started functioning, the chain accelerated. Prairie dogs are relentless grazers. They clip every plant within sight of their burrows down to nothing, not from hunger, but because they need clear sight lines to spot coyotes and hawks. That selective trimming kills off tall grasses and shrubs and favors a very specific group of plants: short, fast-growing, protein-rich. Broadleaf species like scarlet globe mallow, prairie sage, and buffalo grass. the plants that thrive under constant grazing pressure. Within a few years, the vegetation around the colonies shifted completely. Instead of the uniform weeds that take over disturbed land, the prairie dog zones developed a patchwork, closely cropped, nutrient-dense plants next to bare ground next to taller grass on the edges. A different habitat, one that had not existed on the Front Range in decades. Species absent for just as long started showing up to use it. Burrowing owls moved in first. These small raptors cannot dig. They depend entirely on burrows other animals leave behind. As the colonies spread, thousands of abandoned tunnel entrances became available, temperature-regulated nesting cavities sheltered from weather and most predators. The owls took the older, quieter sections of the colonies and raised their young underground in tunnels engineered by rodents. By 2010, biologists were counting some of the highest burrowing owl densities anywhere on the Front Range. Then, mountain plovers arrived, ground-nesting birds that need bare, flat, heavily grazed earth to breed, the exact terrain prairie dogs create. Studies on the refuge found plovers nesting on active colonies produced bigger chicks with higher survival rates than birds nesting elsewhere. The food was richer. The bare ground gave the chicks better sight lines on approaching predators. And the prairie dogs themselves served as an early warning system, barking out alarm calls every time a hawk crossed overhead. The raptors followed the prey. Ferruginous hawks and red-tailed hawks staked out territories over the colonies, drawn by concentrated, visible, accessible food. And the bald eagles, the same birds whose accidental roost had triggered the refuge in the first place, came back in growing numbers, hunting prairie dog towns through winter. The animal that accidentally saved the arsenal was now thriving because of what the arsenal had become. The bison come home. In 2007, wildlife managers released a herd of wild bison onto the refuge. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated move built on the foundation the prairie dogs had laid. Bison are heavy grazers. They naturally seek out the short, high-protein forage that prairie dog colonies produce. On the historical Great Plains, the two species ran a loop. Prairie dogs clipped the grass short and pushed the plant community toward protein-rich species. Bison grazed the taller vegetation on the edges and stopped it from encroaching. Their hooves churned the soil. Their droppings fertilized it. The mosaic the two species built together kept conditions ideal for both, and for every animal that lived alongside them. At the arsenal, the ancient partnership rebooted within months. The bison gravitated straight to the prairie dog zones. Their grazing reinforced the open structure the rodents needed to spot predators. The wallows they dug created shallow pools that filled after rain. New plant communities established along the edges. The loop closed. Two species that had not shared this landscape since before the Civil War were operating as a working unit again, each making conditions better for the other. Neither species had been told what to do. Behavior was already wired in, dormant for a century and a half, waiting for the conditions to come back. The invisible enemy. Through all of it, the prairie dogs were fighting an invisible enemy, sylvatic plague, carried by fleas caused by the same bacterium that drove the Black Death, tore through the colonies 6 times between 1989 and 2002. Each outbreak killed up to 95% of the animals in the affected zones. The deaths came fast. Entire colonies emptied out in weeks. Each time, the chain stalled. Owls lost their burrows. Plovers lost their nesting ground. Raptors and eagles lost their prey base. The whole pyramid wobbled. The refuge fought back with increasingly sophisticated tools. First, biologists dusted individual burrows by hand with insecticide that killed fleas on contact. It worked, but it was painfully slow. 6 acres a day across a refuge the size of a small city. Then they built something remarkable, a peanut butter-flavored vaccine bait, engineered to trigger an immune response in any prairie dog that ate it. Protection against plague without anyone ever having to catch the animal. The baits were dyed bright green and laced with a fluorescent marker that showed up in the animal's whiskers, so biologists could shine a UV light and confirm exactly who had eaten them and who had not. They distributed the baits using modified all-terrain vehicles that covered 60 acres an hour. Drones would have been faster, but Denver International Airport sits next door, and unauthorized drones near a major airport are a federal problem. So the ATVs it was, season after season, year after year. This was not pest control, it was immunological infrastructure built specifically to protect the biological engine running the entire restoration. The rarest mammal in North America. On October 5th, 2015, wildlife managers walked into the northeast section of the refuge with a series of carrying crates. They opened the doors and released approximately 30 black-footed ferrets into the prairie dog colonies. The ferrets disappeared down the burrows within minutes. Black-footed ferrets are the rarest mammal in North America. The story of how they came back is almost impossible. In 1979, the species was declared extinct in the wild. Conservation biologists had been searching for any wild population for years. They found nothing. The species was officially gone. Then, in 1981, a ranch dog named Shep in Meeteetse, Wyoming, dragged a dead animal back to the porch of his owners. The animal was a black-footed ferret. Biologists tracked the dog's find back to a tiny surviving colony on the ranch. 18 animals were captured and placed into an emergency breeding program. Every single black-footed ferret alive today descends from that group. 18 ancestors. An entire species rebuilt from a sample size you could fit in a pickup truck. They eat almost nothing but prairie dogs. A single ferret needs between 100 and 150 prairie dogs a year to survive. They live almost exclusively inside prairie dog burrows. They hunt inside the burrows, sleep inside the burrows, and raise their young inside the burrows. They cannot survive without dense, healthy, plague-managed colonies. Period. The fact that ferrets could be released at the arsenal at all was the proof, not a press release, not a grant report. Physical proof, measured in burrow density and prey count, that the food web had been rebuilt from chemically sterilized ground into a system capable of sustaining an apex predator. Soil microbes at the bottom, grasses on top of them, prairie dogs on top of the grasses, owls, hawks, and eagles above the prairie dogs. And now, at the very top, an animal that had been wiped out of the wild 40 years earlier, released into burrows dug above sealed nerve agent residue. By 2018, the wild ferret population at the arsenal had reached roughly 90 individuals, breeding, hunting prairie dogs in their own burrows, raising kits underground in dens carved out by a different species entirely, on ground that manufactured nerve gas within living memory. Every one of those 90 animals carried the genetic fingerprint of those 18 Wyoming founders. Every successful litter pushed the species one more generation away from being a memory. The numbers, and what still sits below. 714 prairie dogs went into dead soil. The thousands that came after them rebuilt every layer of an ecosystem on top of a sealed, toxic waste dump. The refuge covers more than 15,000 acres, the largest urban wildlife preserve in the United States. 330 documented species, 340,000 visitors a year. The EPA pulled nearly 16,000 acres off its list of the most contaminated sites in the country. 917 of those acres went to Commerce City, where they now hold a high school, a civic center, a professional soccer stadium, and 400 acres of public parks. Total cleanup ran to $2.1 billion, 80% of the entire Department of Defense environmental cleanup budget in peak years. The engineer that rebuilt the living surface weighs 2 pounds, but the poison is not gone, it is buried. 18 inches of crushed concrete sit between a working ecosystem and millions of cubic yards of nerve agent residue. 5 treatment plants still pump the aquifer every hour of every day. Children play soccer on cleaned acres directly above sealed chemical waste. And the ferrets keep, breeding inside burrows above a plague reservoir that has already wiped out their food supply 6 times. The next outbreak is not a question of whether, only when. If a colony of rodents could turn the most poisoned ground in America into the densest wildlife habitat in Colorado, what else is buried under our cities right now? One keystone species away from coming back. Drop the place in the comments. The kids on the soccer field do not know what is 18 inches below them. Subscribe. The next story is a different impossible recovery on entirely different impossible ground. And the animal at the center of it is even less likely than a black-footed ferret.